Okay, we are doing Resolve the Paradox today, GMAT CR, though it's also part of the GRE CR, so if you're here for that, that's also fun. We are going to go through a bit of the basics, but most of today will be working through examples together and kind of discussing best practices via examples, because I think that that is the best way to see how to work through them. So, here are some general tips. When you are dealing with a paradox, what that means is that there are two things that are simultaneously true and they shouldn't be. There's something that makes it so it's odd for them to both be true. Understandably, um, identifying those two facts is a big component of doing well on paradox questions. So, one good tip for how to see that is to rephrase it into a question. How could it be possible that fact one, even though fact two? Something like that. Pay attention to the direction of what is being said. So, an increase in business is not the same as level business, no change, or a decrease in business. That can be an indicator that something is odd. So, pay close attention to that. Don't worry about looking for a conclusion. There will not be. I often use the word argument to describe these passages out of habit, but these are actually not arguments. They are just a series of facts, and then you resolve the paradox. They do not have conclusions. And one of the biggest things about paradox answers is that we are looking for a potential reason that both things could be true, but it does not have to be definitely the reason that's going on. It does not have to even be particularly likely. It just has to explain how both things can be true, even if there's like a 1% chance that that's the real explanation. And there's way better explanations. We don't need a good explanation. We just need an explanation. The main thing is that it has to address both facts. So, we're going to work through 6 examples. You will get a few minutes with each question, and then we will discuss the answers together. You are welcome to bring up any questions while we go through. Once I reveal the correct answer, if you are still confused about something, I do try to talk through everything, but please let me know and we can go back. And if you have general questions, there will be some time at the end for those. You can also ask me during the class, but I might miss it. So if you drop a question in the chat and I don't address it, then just remind me at the end and I will be happy to. I am going to pull up our first example. Also, people usually ask, difficulty on these is the first couple are medium and the last 4 are hard. So they do get harder. If you feel like they're getting harder, you are correct. Here is that. I'm going to open up a poll. Okay. In the small town of Oakville, the proprietors of three locally owned coffee shops located there were dismayed to see that a major coffee shop chain with a big marketing budget had decided to open a shop in town. However, much to the surprise of the locally owned coffee shop's proprietors, after the major coffee chain shop opened, all three locally owned shops experienced significant increases in business. Which of the following does the most to explain the surprising outcome? That's a tip that it's a paradox question because the question stem is surprised by it. Let's look at our breakdowns. So there's a large coffee chain. They have a big marketing budget and they're moving into this small town. The owners of the three coffee shops that are already here are concerned about it taking away business from them. But surprise, the owners are surprised to see that the presence of the large chain not only doesn't take business away from them, but in fact increases the sales they're doing. So here is a direction tip. The large chain is increasing their sales. That makes it more of a paradox than if their sales were level or decreased. That gives you some indication of how to approach it. And then this is a version of how I would do the paradox question. How is it possible that the local coffee shops experienced an increase in business after the major chain moved to town? Let's look at our choices. A. Most of the people who regularly drink coffee in Oakville prefer the taste of the locally owned shop's coffee over that of the major chain's coffee. That does not explain an increase in business. Presumably, these people were already doing business with these coffee shops in that case. B. During peak hours, the length of time customers spend in line at the major chain shop is often longer than some people are willing to wait. So, this is something worth noting as well. Some people, when it comes to critical reasoning, the word some means at least one and possibly all. So, oftentimes, an answer that uses the term some to qualify an amount of people or whatever is going to be too vague to help. There are situations where it can absolutely be the correct answer, but a lot of times it will be something like this where that can mean any number of things, and we're looking for a clear impact. So if some people aren't willing to wait that long, if that's like two people, does it matter? If it's all the people, it would be different. We're looking for a clear impact. So B is too vague to really help us. C, the proprietors of the locally owned coffee shops have run the shops for many years and are familiar to residents of Oakville. Similar to A, this doesn't explain an increase in business. It might explain not a decrease in business, but that's not what we're trying to explain. D, the marketing messages that the major chain shop puts out to potential customers have convinced many that drinking coffee is enjoyable and life enhancing. So this offers a potential explanation. This mega chain moves in, they have a lot of marketing money. They're putting out ads. The ads are just like, hey, you should drink some coffee. People are saying that they're going to their local coffee shops. If there are more total people drinking coffee, then that would explain an increase in business. And it doesn't have to mean anything about the major chains' sales. Maybe they're doing really well and they've, through their ads, greatly increased the number of people that are consuming coffee in Oakville. Maybe they're not doing as well because their ads talk about how great coffee is and everyone also loves to shop local. It doesn't really matter. We don't need to have that information. This offers a potential way to resolve the paradox because it is talking about an increase in total business, and we are trying to discover a way that the local coffee shops have experienced an increase in business. And E, the major chain shop serves not only coffee, but also gourmet sandwiches and desserts. This is a related but irrelevant trap answer. So it talks about, coffee shops. But this means nothing. Like, I've never been to a coffee shop that didn't also serve sandwiches and stuff. So that's really just trying to be on topic without doing anything. All right. Our best answer is D. Yeah, people who weren't even going to buy coffee might have seen these ads and decided that they did want some coffee after all, and then stopped by the local coffee shops and increased their business. Any questions on that? Perfect. Let me pull up this next one. Hey, since automated teller machines, ATMs, can handle many of the tasks that are handled by tellers in banks, banks that use ATMs generally need fewer tellers per bank branch than would be necessary without the use of ATMs. In the United States, the number of ATMs increased by approximately 300% from 1995 to 2010. Yet, during the same time, the number of tellers working for banks also increased. What what a surprising outcome. Let's explain it. So, it tells you what an ATM is, so we're all on the same page. And then it says in the US, the number of ATMs quadrupled. It increased by 300% from 1995 to 2010. Yet at that same time, the number of tellers working for banks also increased. How is it that even though ATMs are doing all these things that tellers do, and they allow bank branches to operate with fewer tellers, the number of bank tellers also increased while the number of ATMs quadrupled? A. Since the use of ATMs reduces the cost of operating a branch, banks open branches in locations where, without ATMs, branches would not have been profitable. So, this is helpful. The argument tells us that ATMs generally allow a bank branch to operate with fewer tellers. But what this says is perhaps the banks are opening more branches and they have been able to open so many more branches that even though each individual branch has fewer tellers than it would without an ATM, the overall number of tellers was able to increase because there were so many more branches that needed some tellers, thanks to ATMs making it profitable to open branches in places that would have otherwise not been profitable to open branches. B, there are many tasks that bank tellers handle that are too sophisticated for ATMs to handle. That is kind of a contradiction. We know that the ATMs can handle many of the tasks that are handled by tellers and banks, and that banks that use ATMs generally need fewer tellers per branch. So even if there are many tasks that bank tellers handle that are too sophisticated for ATMs, we already know that ATMs can replace some of the tellers at every branch. C, some bank customers prefer to use tellers rather than ATMs, even for transactions that could be handled by ATMs. Again, some bank customers, how many is that? And also, even if that could justify not a decrease in tellers, it doesn't justify an increase. D, because many bank customers use ATMs, as ATM use increased, the lines associated with using bank tellers became shorter on average than such lines were in the past. You can maybe spin a story about this being relevant, but it just isn't. Even if the lines are shorter, that doesn't mean that people are going to see the shorter lines and then all of a sudden they're going to need a lot more tellers. We already know that they need less tellers per branch. And E, as ATMs took over handling many of the simpler tasks that tellers had handled, tellers took on more complex tasks and got paid more. That I feel like is a pretty good trap answer. But that one also doesn't explain an increase in tellers. It might also explain like a level amount of tellers if they were able to handle more complex tasks and spend less time on transactions. But even with E, there could still be a decrease because the ATM is taking a lot of the simple tasks off their hands. Maybe they don't need as many tellers. So E, I think, is tempting, but it doesn't quite resolve the paradox because it doesn't give us a reason to think that the number of tellers should have increased. So, yes, banks need fewer tellers per branch, but if they open more branches, then maybe they need more tellers overall. Any questions on that one? So those two are medium. I believe this one is our first hard question. The correct answer on example 2 was A, that the ATMs allowed banks to open branches that in areas that would have otherwise not been profitable. Okay. A certain Midwestern A certain Midwestern American town had only two hardware stores. One of them closed down last year. Surprisingly, following the closing of that store, demand for goods sold in the remaining store has decreased. Why might that be? So, we've got these two hardware stores and one closed down. So now there's only one left. Instead of the remaining store getting some portion of the sales that the now closed store used to make, its sales have also declined. How is it that after one half of the total hardware stores closed, the remaining store experienced a decline in sales? Let's look at our choices. A. Over the past year, the town invested in the district in which the remaining hardware store is located, making the district more attractive to shoppers. If anything, that makes the paradox more paradoxical because it should attract more shoppers, but they're still losing business. What is going on? B. The remaining hardware store is run by a national corporation with no close ties to the community in which the store is located. This is not new. Presumably, this has always been the case. And so that might explain why customers of the other hardware store didn't come over here, but it does not explain a decrease in sales. C, in a town near the town in which the hardware store is located, a store that had been selling some hardware type items in one department closed that department. This also deepens the paradox. These people can't even go to this neighboring town to get their hardware stuff. D, after the other hardware store closed, the store manager at the remaining store did not make any significant changes to that store's operations. Also, they had some customers. This is not new. Why would that lead to a decrease in sales? And E, the store that closed had been offering free classes via which people could learn how to undertake projects requiring tools and supplies available at hardware stores. So the store that closed was offering DIY classes. So you could go there and you could learn about home stuff that you can do with stuff that you buy at a hardware store, which could have increased demand in the whole town, not just for that store. But now that those free classes aren't available, that external factor that was increasing demand, education, isn't there anymore. And that could have caused the overall town's demand for hardware to decrease. Let me share. Any questions on that one? Okay. So, like I said at the beginning, but I think it's easier to see with questions, direction is such a huge part of paradoxes because it helps you not deepen the paradox by paying attention to direction, but it also helps you explain what needs to be explained. And that is why you've got to pay very careful attention to the words used in any critical reasoning passage, but these are particular about direction and how big of an impact it has. Yeah, let's see here. After the other hardware store closed, the store manager at the remaining store did not make any significant changes to that store's operations. So, this hardware store that stayed open is experiencing a decrease in business. But D is talking about something that didn't change. So it's basically saying after the other hardware store closed, the store manager kept things as they were at the remaining hardware store. Why would that lead to a decrease in business? It was they had some amount of business under these conditions before, and the conditions didn't change, so that doesn't explain that decrease. Does that help, Amelia? Okay, awesome. All right. Here is this one. Okay. An experimental program in France involved having hiring companies that received resumes from the state employment agency volunteer to receive the resumes they got from the agency in anonymous form, i.e., without the applicants' names or addresses. The purpose of the program was to determine whether using such resumes would reduce hiring discrimination against recent immigrants, who often could be identified as such as a result of their names or places of residence. Surprisingly, while participating in the program, the companies reduced rather than increased their hiring of recent immigrants. So, experimental program in France is giving these companies the option to get resumes in anonymous form. Notice that this is optional. They have to sign up for it. Our first fact is the program's purpose is to see if using anonymized resumes would reduce hiring discrimination because they're taking off the information that would help them identify recent immigrants. And yet, these companies that should be reduced. No, their hiring of recent immigrants rather than increasing or keeping it level. So, why did using the anonymous resumes lead to a decrease rather than the predicted increase or leveling of in the hiring of recent immigrants? Let's look at our choices, and I will share these. A. In France, the resumes of recent immigrants are more likely to include significant gaps in work history than are those of other job applicants. This one doesn't, this one sounds like it might resolve the paradox, but it doesn't actually do so because those gaps are there either way. They're not, when they anonymize the resumes, they're not taking off the gaps in employment. So that is something that has not changed. So if that was the cause, then we would expect things to be level. B, no companies known to have track records of hiring discrimination against recent immigrants participated in the program. Then we're not even talking about them. That is why it's so important to notice that it is voluntary. Those companies didn't sign up. We're actually only talking about the companies that did. C, in addition to receiving anonymous resumes from the agency, the companies involved in the program continued to receive resumes with names and addresses directly from private individuals. This is also something that has not changed. So they are getting these anonymous resumes. They presumably hire some rate of immigrants. They're also getting resumes with the names and addresses directly from private individuals, but there's no indication that there has been an increase in those. So this is another thing that sounds like it could be helpful, but doesn't actually make it to being helpful. D, in many cases, it is possible to determine via considering aspects of a resume other than name and address that it is likely that an applicant is a recent immigrant. These companies are signing up for this program, so they're probably not signing up for this optional program and then still going out of their way to discriminate against immigrants. If they didn't want to sign up, they could have just not signed up in the first place. It was optional. So that one doesn't really help. And E, the hiring practices of most of the companies that volunteered to receive anonymous resumes, included making allowances for minor deficiencies in resumes of recent immigrants. So before they got these anonymous resumes, if they saw, for instance, like significant gaps in work, but then they saw the name or the address and they realized or assumed that the person was an immigrant, they might have been like, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. But now they're not seeing the name and address, they're just seeing these deficiencies with no context. So when they would have been previously making some allowances for minor deficiencies, they now no longer have the trigger that shows them, hey, we might make allowances for this minor deficiency. And that could resolve the paradox. That could be a reason that hiring of recent immigrants has decreased under the programs. Oh, that's that one. Given that would be What if they were hiring recent immigrants before only to complete their diversity programs, so might have ignored the gaps in work experience given that they would be diversity hires for choice A? Let me look. So that's a good question. This this is about anonymous resumes. So you're talking about diversity programs, affirmative action. That very well could apply in the real world, but we do not know the situation here, so we cannot necessarily assume that without going outside the bounds of the argument. So while that is something that absolutely would be relevant in a holistic context, critical reasoning is not holistic. It is very flat. You really have to take the information that they give you and try to not stray too far from it. So that is the problem with A, because we have no reason to think that their diversity programs have changed at all. Perhaps they're anonymous and they still have to meet those quotas even if they can't see the names and addresses. It's just a little bit past what the argument supports. Any other questions on this one? Okay. And some of these are quite tricky. So that is what the discussion is for. Yeah. Okay. 100 years ago, words were expressions associated with sophisticated writing, such as whereby or such that, represented a percentage of printed text much greater than the percentage of printed text represented by such words today. This change has occurred even though the proportion of the world population considered well educated has increased many-fold over the same period of time. 100 years ago, sophisticated writing represented a much larger percentage of printed text than such words do today. So if it represented 50% of all printed texts, now it represents 10. Fact two, the proportion of the world population, also a percentage, considered well educated has increased many-fold over that same period. Why is it that as the percentage of the population that is considered well educated has increased, the percentage of printed text represented by sophisticated writing has decreased? Let's look at our choices. Hey, the number of living people considered poorly educated or illiterate has increased significantly over the past 100 years. This is not helpful because we are talking about percentages, and we know that the percentage of people that are considered well educated has increased over the past 100 years. So what this says isn't really relevant. B, currently, people often employ words or expressions associated with sophisticated writing for the purpose of making writing that is not particularly sophisticated seem sophisticated. This is sort of related, but it is not relevant. It does not resolve the paradox because we still have more well-educated, or we still have a higher percentage of well-educated people than ever before and a lower percentage of quote-unquote sophisticated writing. So even if people do this, the percentage is still lower. The paradox is not resolved. B, over time, the popularity of words or expressions can increase or decrease significantly. This is very tempting, but it doesn't give us what we need. So the popularity of words or expressions can increase or decrease significantly. Did they increase? Did they decrease? All this is saying is that that can happen. Without something more concrete, the impact of C is nothing because we need something that explains this and not just a vague concept about, oh, it could increase or decrease significantly. That's just not helpful. D, over the past 100 years, equipment used for generating printed text has become increasingly available to people with little education. So, if 100 years ago, one person in a town had the ability to print text and they were smart, and they used sophisticated writing, I should say, then 100% of the people in that town would have used sophisticated writing. But now, as the equipment is becoming more readily available, more and more people have access to it. If any people that don't use sophisticated writing started generating printed text, then that would lead to an increase in the percentage of printed text that does not use sophisticated writing. So D does help us resolve the paradox. And E, it is often possible to convey sophisticated ideas without the use of words or expressions normally associated with sophisticated writing. Be that as it may, we are talking about words or expressions normally associated with sophisticated writing. So this one is very slightly just off topic, and it does not resolve the paradox. So our best choice is D. So if 100 years ago, this one person, they're the only person printing out writing, and they use sophisticated writing, then the printed text would not be representative of the average town person's writing because the average town person doesn't have access to this material. But later, now, as the equipment becomes more readily available to people with little education, we're moving closer to the median level of writing that everyone would do and not necessarily an elite level of writing because only the elites have access to this technology. Any questions about this one? And then we have one more. Pull that one up. I don't I don't like to do the annotation because it messes up the sharing sometimes. Okay, for more than a decade, doctors have recommended that women over age 40 get yearly mammograms, which use x rays to enable doctors to better check for cancerous breast tumors. The rationale is that by finding a cancerous tumor early, doctors have the best chance of successfully treating the tumor. In fact, almost all research indicates that mammograms do find tumors in all stages of growth, from early to advanced. However, in recent years, some doctors have stopped recommending yearly mammograms to their female patients. This is an accept question, so let's get our breakdown. For over 10 years, doctors have recommended that women over 40 get yearly mammograms. Almost all research indicates that mammograms find tumors in all stages, and that finding cancerous tumors early gives doctors the best chance of successful treatment. However, in recent years, some doctors have stopped recommending yearly mammograms to their female patients. If mammograms are so successful at detecting tumors at all stages, then why have these doctors stopped recommending them to their patients? Let's look at our review. So we're going to go through all of the things that resolve the paradox because this is an accept question. So the x-rays used in mammograms in creating an image of a woman's breast can cause cancerous tumors to grow in the tissue the x-rays penetrated. So if the mammograms themselves are causing cancerous tumors to grow, then that would be a reason that doctors might not want to recommend them, even if they're great at finding tumors, as they're also causing tumors. Not ideal. These. The detection of larger, more aggressive tumors, the ones that will cause health problems, was unchanged in frequency from the prior decade when mammograms were not routinely used. So if the mammograms aren't finding the malignant tumors, the ones that are going to cause health problems, then the fact that they're finding some tumors wouldn't be much reason to recommend them. This choice gives us a reason that they could be finding tumors of all sizes, but not the most aggressive ones that are going to cause issues. And so perhaps doctors don't think it's worth it if they're not finding the ones that are going to cause the most issues. D, a mammogram can often indicate suspicious breast tissue when no suspicious tissue actually exists, resulting in a false positive, which can lead to unnecessary medical procedures with health risks. So if the mammogram indicates a false positive, and the steps that we take to address that false positive can lead to unnecessary medical procedures with health risks, then that could be a reason that doctors don't think they are worth recommending. Perhaps it's not. Perhaps the chance of a false positive and unnecessary medical procedures and the risks associated with them is higher for those doctors than any health savings they would get from tumor detection. And recent studies show that mammograms have not increased the survival rates of women over 40 with breast cancer. So, if the survival rates of the women that the doctors were recommending the mammograms to in the first place, women over 40, have not improved, then maybe they stopped recommending them because there was no improvement. So that could resolve the paradox. The answer that does not resolve the paradox is this one. Estimates suggest that about 2/3 of the reduction in breast cancer deaths in recent years is due to better treatments, not better detection. Even if this was true, that is a whole 1/3 of deaths that could have been up to mammograms. That is a lot. So this one does not resolve the paradox because a majority of people, a majority of the reduction in breast cancer deaths, 66%, is just, that still leaves so many percent that we could maybe fix with mammograms. So, any questions on this one? Or anything else? I was confused between A and C. How to choose when we have narrowed down to two options, which seems seemingly close. So the last two were the hardest to drill down to because the top choice and the second top choice are going to be, especially on harder questions, they will be closer. You're really just looking for a reason to discard one of them. So with this one, I would just run the math. With C, C is also like very tempting, but it's basically it's harder to find a solid reason to discard C because it could be that the mammograms are just not really helping that many people, whereas with A, the mammograms could still be helping 1/3 of people or 1/3 of the reduction in breast cancer deaths, which is still a significant amount. But yes, that final two, those are the hardest two to pick between. Any other questions on this one? And then if not, I believe someone wanted me to go back over question 2, so I will pop back over there. Okay, let me go back to question 2. Okay, B and E. Okay, so this is the one where the ATMs have quadrupled over the last or over this 15-year period, and yet the number of bank tellers also increased. So let's see. Choice B, there are many tasks that bank tellers handle that are too sophisticated for ATMs to handle. So the key to seeing that C doesn't resolve this is that if you are doing, say your job is like 10 tasks, do you spend the same amount of time on all the tasks? So perhaps these tellers have many tasks that they do, but previously they were like 10% of the time, and they're mostly doing things that ATMs could do. So even if there are many tasks that the bank tellers handle that are too sophisticated for ATMs, perhaps the ATMs could still take the less sophisticated tasks off of the bank teller's plate enough that they would have more dedicated time for sophisticated tasks, and they in that case they could still reduce the number of tellers working, but it increased. So that one can be true, but it does not necessarily explain the increase in tellers working. And the other one, E. As ATMs took over handling many of the simpler tasks that tellers had handled, tellers took on more complex tasks and got paid more. Same sort of deal. That could explain a level number of tellers because perhaps they just restructured the job and they gave them more complex tasks and the ATMs took over simpler tasks, but it doesn't explain why there was an increase in tellers. For it to explain an increase, both B and E would have to introduce new tasks. It would have to be like, oh, there's these new tasks that the tellers weren't doing before, but now it is the responsibility of tellers, and perhaps that increased like the demand on tellers' time enough that there is a larger demand for tellers. But all of these, all B or E are saying is that people do some hard parts of their job that a robot can't. But that's always kind of been the case. So if they were able to staff a certain number of tellers they before they got ATMs, and then the ATMs took some tasks off the tellers' plates, then that could explain why they didn't reduce the number of tellers depending on how much the ATMs took off their plates, or they could have even still reduced the number depending on what percentage of the time tellers are spending on these complex tasks, but it does not explain an increase in either case. I eliminated E because of the language at the end of the sentence got paid more, which felt like extraneous info to me. Yeah, that's just kind of a distraction because we're not talking about payment at all. It definitely it definitely does not explain an increase in tellers. Any other questions about this one? Awesome. Okay. Or anything else? Any general questions about the test? Anything like that? Okay. I'm going to pop my email into the chat. If you do have any questions later, then you can reach out to me. If you have any questions about the course, you can also reach out to me. But that way, if you think of something after we wrap up, then you can reach out and I would be happy to discuss with you. And then this webinar will be available in typically a couple of days. So by Monday, they typically have it out there. Okay. Any other questions? And if not, we are all set. Thank you all. Have a great weekend.